Think about this. When we think of fascism, many of us think of right-wing or nationalist organizations. The Nazi Party is often the example that comes to mind. But there's a growing break in the narrative that Nazis were indeed right-wing fascists. The idea that everything hateful comes from the far right and everything full of compassion is from the far left seems like an unusable generalization. It assumes that anyone who's full of compassion, and most people are, must subscribe to the far left. In addition, it provides a hall pass for hate that radiates from that side of the political spectrum. There are good, bad, hateful, and compassionate things that come from all over the political landscape. In this episode, we'll examine the Nazi Party and try to unpack where they land by defining a model to map the political landscape, determining how the Nazi Party became the solution Germany wanted, and examine where they land on this political landscape. If you think these conversations are as fun as I do, hit those like and subscribe buttons. My name is Chris, and this is the Think Report. Before I dig in, I want to say thank you to all the comments and likes on my last video. I do my best to read them all, and I appreciate them very much. This episode is a journey we're going to take together. I have my own assumptions about where the Nazi Party lands on the political landscape, but I'm going to challenge them and try to untangle the logical truth. My opinion should be obvious, but I'm going to try to provide you with enough information so that you can form your own opinion as well. If you think I've misinterpreted something or missed some important information, feel free to let me know in the comments. To start us off, I commissioned a survey to check what the general population thinks of this question. Using a small sample size of 150 US respondents on the platform Pollfish, the results weren't too surprising. The survey question was, to the best of your knowledge, was the Nazi Party right-wing or left-wing? 19% of the people thought it was left, 30% of the people thought it was right, 12% said neither, and 39% said they didn't know, which is fair. I didn't want any guesses. I wanted people with opinions, like you guys, to give me their honest answer. If we remove the respondents who selected neither and I don't know, 60% versus 40% believe that they are right-wing. So this gives us a basis to start from. The majority of the US population believes the Nazi Party was indeed right-wing. Let's dig in and either validate or disprove that opinion. Let's start by defining our political measuring tape. It appears that much of the broken narrative about whether the Nazis were left or right-wing has to do with the model we use to evaluate our political landscape. We tend to refer to a spectrum or a continuum of the left versus the right. But this doesn't stand up to scrutiny. For example, anarchists and right-wing nationalists are both far right, but they almost have nothing in common. As a result, our common left-right spectrum appears insufficient. The reason for this seems to be that the left-right model crams a variety of different factors into just two things, left and right. This seems to have fit for traditional Western ideologies, but it misses more exotic governments like the Nazis or Mussolini's Italian fascist government. So I think we can break this down a bit further. The right side of the spectrum, i.e. conservatism, can be broken down into two separate variables: economic privatization and social conservatism. The left side, i.e. socialism, can be broken down into economic publicization and social progressivism. None of these values are any better or worse than the other. Too much social progressivism creates vulnerabilities like using experimental hormone treatments on minors, and too much social conservatism is oppression. All these variables serve a purpose of measuring the balance of a political ideology. I think that looking at a two-dimensional model instead of a one-dimensional keeps it simple while providing much-needed accuracy. Let's test it out. Consider the US Republican Party. They're moderate on economic privatization, as many of them are capitalists, but they're also moderate on social conservatism, as many of them are Christian or have traditional values and want to preserve those. But this model also allows us to include other more exotic governments like Putin's government, which is mild economic publicization, but high on social conservatism. There's a third part to this where we add the Z-axis. That's the one that comes directly at you and makes the chart 3D. On this axis, we can graph government presence. High government presence would be authoritarianism, fascism, totalitarianism, and dictatorships. Low government presence would be anarchy. I think we can all agree that the Nazis were at least high on government presence. There doesn't seem to be any disagreement on whether or not they were fascists, just whether or not they were on the left or the right. So we'll exclude that dimension for the scope of this episode. Before we move on, let's color our model with some examples. According to the World Population Review, there are 5 communist countries left in the world. These countries are China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam. We're not going to chart communism or capitalism because these are economic models, not a form of government. For example, 3 of the 5 communist countries in the world today have dictatorships as the form of government, but the other 2, Vietnam and Laos, have multi-member authoritarian governments. But we can map these governments. Cuba, for example, has a moderately high economic publicization and moderately high on social conservatism. Traditional socialists would be moderate on social progressivism and somewhere in the middle on the economic axis. Traditional liberals would be moderate on social progressivism and moderate on economic privatization. Traditional conservatives would be more moderate on economic privatization and moderate on social conservatism. After World War I, the newly formed German democratic government saw the Versailles Treaty as dictated peace. In summary, the Versailles Treaty forced Germans to take full responsibility for World War I, make them pay for the damages to other countries, limited the size of their military, and redistributed their land to other countries, including overseas territories. It would be an understatement to say that this was an unfortunate situation for Germany. The reparations and general inflationary period in Europe in the 1920s caused spiraling hyperinflation. This hyperinflationary period combined with the effects of the Great Depression to undermine the stability of the German economy. These conditions wiped out personal savings of the middle class and led to catastrophic unemployment. To help visualize this, you can compare it to the economic state of Argentina today, which has been perpetually in a state of hyperinflation for the last 30 years, and the average citizen has no meaningful savings. This economic chaos contributed to the social unrest and the instability of the fragile German Republic. A user commented in one of my previous videos that pride is the source of hate. I love the comment, but I don't believe this is accurate. I think insecurity and fear is the source of hate. In the case of Germany, hyperinflation, the growing gap between the upper and lower classes, the loss of territory and a military, the threat of immigration posed to their culture, and the uncertain financial future of German families created massive insecurity and fear of not being able to put food on the table. This was fodder for hatred against countries that imposed the Treaty of Versailles and the capitalists that hoarded all the wealth within Germany. So, who were the wealthy in Germany, you ask? According to the 1933 German census, the Jewish population was about 500,000 people, or less than 0.75% of the total German population. However, in spite of their small population, they punched above their weight in economic contributions, owning between 2 and 2.5% of German wealth, according to the German Statistical Office. So, how is it that they punched above their weight? According to an MIT study by Cochrane, Hardy, and Harpending, Ashkenazi Jews have the highest average IQ of any ethnic group, while no similar elevation of intelligence was observed among Jews in classical times, nor is one seen in Sephardic or Oriental Jews today. The average IQ for an Ashkenazi Jew is 110, and they're largely located in Europe and the US. Specifically, in the 1933 German census, Ashkenazi Jews made up 60% of all Jews in Germany, meaning that it should be no surprise that Jews in Germany held more wealth per capita since their average IQ was 10 points higher than the German average, giving them an intellectual advantage over their German neighbors. Now, this pattern isn't new. According to a 2016 Pew Research study, Jews are the richest religious group in the US and overrepresent on Nobel Prize winners. We're seeing similar patterns with Chinese and Indian descendants in the US, but I have a note on that a bit later. To make the problem even worse, the German media exaggerated the amount of Jewish wealth in Germany, claiming that the small population of Jews, 0.75% of the total population, remember, owned up to 20% of the country's wealth. This is how the media helped to underpin anti-Semitism. The nationalist flavor for protecting German culture wasn't a new idea that suddenly appeared when times got tough for Germany. According to a book by J Ley, 19th century German eugenicist Max Gruber described female chastity as a great national possession, which was essential to support healthy families in a healthy society. He suggested that this was the reason that men fought against female infidelity, not mere selfishness, but because female sexual fidelity had the potential for destroying the fabric of German society. Essentially, he's claiming that Germans felt the need to procreate within their own ethnicity. Germans were desperate. They believed that the world had unfairly punished them for World War I. They believed that non-German ethnic Jews owned all their wealth, all while struggling to put food on their own table. Promises to rearm, reclaim German territory, remilitarize the Rhineland, and regain European and world prominence after the humiliating World War I defeat appealed to ultra-nationalist sentiment. These promises helped some of the average voters overlook the more radical tenets of the Nazi ideology. Broadly speaking, I think we now understand how the Nazis became so popular. The next thing to do is to evaluate where they stood on the political landscape by scoring their political tenets on our political map. Let's visit the 25 tenets from the Nazi platform and see where they land. This translation of their platform was taken from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Number 1. We demand the union of all Germans in a greater Germany on the basis of the right of national self-determination. My interpretation here is that they demanded all Germans living abroad must join the Nazis in their cause. This screams cultural preservation, so that's 1 point for social conservatism. 2. We demand equality of rights for the German people in its dealings with other nations, and the revocation of the peace treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain. This has to do with the economics of Germany and digging it out of hyperinflation. This is good for the country and good for the individual, but every country in this economic situation would want this, regardless of their political orientation. As a result, I don't see this as a point for any direction on our map. This is the only tenet that will receive this exception. 3. We demand land and territory to feed our people and to settle our surplus population. This pertains to point number 1. They're asking Germans abroad to return to Germany. Consequently, they'll need land to hold them. This means the appropriation of land from the countries surrounding Germany. The goal of this policy is to care for its ethnicity, pure German people, without importing goods from abroad. So this would be social conservatism. 4. Only members of the nation may be citizens of the state. Only those of German blood, whatever their creed, may be members of the nation. Accordingly, no Jew may be a member of the nation. This obviously screams social conservatism, as they are attempting to preserve their ethnicity. 5. Non-citizens may live in Germany only as guests and must be subject to laws for aliens. Non-citizens have special laws, which is a model that most every country has. The purpose is to ensure that aliens cannot influence German policy. This is 1 point for social conservatism. 6. The right to vote on the state's government and legislation shall be enjoyed by the citizens of the state alone. We demand, therefore, that all official appointments of whatever kind, whether in the Reich or in the states or in smaller localities, shall be held by none but citizens. We oppose the corrupting parliamentary system of filing posts merely in accordance with party considerations and without reference to character or abilities. They're essentially saying that only citizens of Germany can hold government positions, and it must be based on merit. Sounds reasonable, right? This is social conservatism. If it was social progressivism, it would allow non-citizens to hold government positions for reasons other than merit, like race. 7. We demand that the state make it its primary duty to provide a livelihood for its citizens. If it should prove impossible to feed the entire population, foreign nationals must be deported from the Reich. There are 2 things here. For the government to make it its own primary duty to provide a livelihood for its citizens and not leave them to fend for themselves, it must adopt communist policies to some extent. So for that, we give it a point for economic publicization. In addition, for Germany to export foreign nationals if it cannot meet its economic goals, That's social conservatism. 8. All non-German immigration must be prevented. We demand that all non-Germans who entered Germany after the 2nd of August 1914 shall be required to leave the Reich forthwith. This is clearly social conservatism. They're kicking everyone out who migrated to Germany within the previous 20 years. 9. All citizens shall have equal rights and duties. Equal rights is social progressivism, but equal duties is communism. For that, it gets a point for each. 10. It must be the first duty of every citizen to perform physical or mental work. The activities of the individual must not clash with the general interest, but must proceed within the framework of the community and be for the general good. They don't want welfare. Everyone must work. That's economic privatization. In addition, whatever work you choose, you must proceed within the framework of the community. That's social conservatism. 11. We demand the abolition of incomes unearned by work. I believe this means no welfare and no income from capital gains, which cancels each other out. But we'll score 1 for economic publicization for no capital gains and 1 for economic privatization for no welfare. Furthermore, in 1933, the stock exchange supervision was taken away from the states and made the domain of the central government. With the number of stock exchanges reduced from 21 to 9, the stock market activity was reduced significantly. 12. In view of the enormous sacrifices of life and property demanded of a nation by any war, the personal enrichment from war must be regarded as a crime against the nation. We demand, therefore, the ruthless confiscation of all war profits. Essentially, the government will confiscate any profiteering from war. That's economic publicization. 13. We demand the nationalization of all businesses which have been formed into corporations. This is a big one. Any corporations will be confiscated by the government. That's a communist ideology. They're essentially okay with small businesses, but big business is prohibited. To the best of my research, the only examples of the German government actually confiscating any big business were Jewish businesses. Nonetheless, even though they selected based on ethnicity, they still did it. So that's economic publicization. 14. We demand profit sharing in large industrial enterprises. Essentially, they want to take the profits from the business and distribute that to the employees and likely the government too. That's economic publicization. 15. We demand extensive development of insurance for old age. Taking care of your elderly and making it part of your social contract is social conservatism. 16. We demand the creation and the maintenance of a healthy middle class, the immediate communalizing of big department stores and their lease at a cheap rate to small traders, and that the utmost consideration shall be shown to all small traders in the placing of state and municipal orders. There are 2 things packed into this one. The creation of a middle class and cheap leases to small traders is economic privatization, but the communalizing of big department stores is economic publicization. 17. We demand a land reform suitable for our national requirements. The passing of a law for the expropriation of land for communal purposes without compensation, the abolition of ground rent, and the prohibition of all speculation in land. Essentially, the government's going to take your land, and that's economic publicization. 18. We demand the ruthless prosecution of those whose activities are injurious to the common interest. Common criminals, usurers, profiteers, etc. must be punished with death. Common criminals punished by death. That's social conservatism all the way. 19. We demand that Roman law, which serves as materialistic world order, be replaced by a German common law. According to the California Western International Law Journal, Hitler dismissed the existing legal code as Romano-Jewish Byzantine law. It was characterized as individualistic and mechanical. In contrast, German law was described as the product of altruistic and collective sensibility. It was depicted as being based on emotion and romanticism rather than reason, and was described as a product of common blood rather than shared history. For this reason, this is social conservatism. 20. The state must consider a thorough reconstruction of our national system of education, with the aim of opening up to every able and hardworking German the possibility of higher education, and thus obtaining advancement. The curricula of all educational establishments must be brought into line with the requirements of practical life. The aim of the school must be to give the pupil, beginning with the first signs of intelligence, a grasp of the notion of the state through the study of civic affairs. We demand the education of gifted children of poor parents, whatever their class or occupation, at the expense of the state. Free education is generally a good thing, but as stated in the policy, the goal of this education is to educate the pupil about the notion of the state. In this case, this is social conservatism. 21. The state must ensure that the nation's health standards are raised by protecting mothers and infants, by prohibiting child labor, by promoting physical strength through legislation providing for compulsory gymnastics and sports, and by the extensive support of clubs engaged in physical training of youth. Mandatory exercise is a healthy thing to do, but mandating it is also social conservatism. 22. We demand the abolition of the mercenary army and the formation of a people's army. Essentially, no more private armies or hired armies. This is economic publicization. 23. We demand legal warfare on deliberate political mendacity and its dissemination in the press. To facilitate the creation of a German national press, we demand A. That all editors and contributors to newspapers appearing in the German language must be members of the nation. B. That no non-German newspapers may appear without the express permission of the state. They must not be printed in the German language. C. That non-Germans shall be prohibited by law from participating financially or in influencing German newspapers, and that the penalty for contravening such law shall be the suppression of any such newspaper and the immediate deportation of the non-Germans involved. The publishing of papers which are not conducive to the national welfare must be forbidden. We demand the legal prosecution of all those tendencies in art and literature which corrupt our national life, and the suppression of our cultural events which violate this demand. Controlling the media and effectively free speech is social conservatism. 24. We demand freedom for all religious denominations in the state, provided they do not threaten its existence nor offend the moral feelings of the German race. The party as such stands for positive Christianity, but does not commit itself to any particular denomination. It combats the Jewish materialistic spirit within and without us, and is convinced that our nation can only achieve permanent health only from within on the basis of this principle, the common interest before the self-interest. So Germans can be any religion insofar as they don't offend the moral feelings of the German race. That's clearly social conservatism. 25. To put the whole of this program into effect, we demand the creation of a strong central state power for the Reich, the unconditional authority of the political central parliament over the entire Reich and its organizations, in the formulation of corporations based on estate and occupation for the purpose of carrying out general legislation passed by the Reich in various German states. There are two things in this one: the ultimate power of the government to do whatever they want, and the establishing of the objective of corporations to specifically carry out the direction of the government. That's 1 point for social conservatism and 1 point for economic publicization. Looking at where we ended up on our political model, it's clear the Nazis were high on social conservatism, moderately high on economic publicization, moderately low on economic privatization, and low on social progressivism. This puts them close to the top and left of center. Referring back to the classic left-right political spectrum, this presents a problem. The Nazis embody social conservatism, which is a feature of the right, and economic publicization, which is a feature of the left. It's no wonder that we're confused about which side of the political spectrum the Nazis fall on, and further demonstrates the uselessness of the basic left-right model. So to answer our ultimate question, were they on the left or the right, the answer is yes and yes. They were both. So why is all of this important? We know the phrase, "those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." I don't want to be too audacious and declare that there are modern movements that have some vague resemblance to any Nazi characteristics, but there are a couple things to consider as we wade further into the 21st century. The first is that social conservatism are groups that aim to preserve or enforce their values on the rest of the population. In the case of the Nazis, it was nationalism. Traditionally in the US, Canada, and the UK, this has been Christian or traditional values that are imposed on the rest of us. The resistance to gay marriage or abortion are examples of this. As we move to social progressivism, we become more open and tolerant of a variety of different values and perspectives. But as movements become more and more progressive, certain movements start to become intolerant of other views. J.K. Rowling being cancelled because of her views on transgender is an example of this. In this case, the woke progressive end up actually quite socially conservative. Just like Christian intolerance of gay marriage, the woke intolerance of opposing viewpoints on transgender is also a conservative modality. The second is that there's a growing intolerance against Chinese descendants in the US. Harvard is already discriminating against people with Chinese ancestry with their acceptance rates. It's true that Chinese immigrants do outperform other ethnic populations in the US in education. But this makes sense, right? Like, we allow the best and the brightest of other countries to immigrate to the US, Canada, and the UK. So it should be no surprise that their averages outperform our averages. This is not dissimilar to the Jews outperforming the Aryan population in Germany in the 1930s. Therefore, not a far stretch to say that the wrong leader or the wrong media outlet could make a bad situation out of this. Think about that.